Okay, so this is a video that kind of serves as a sequel video of sorts, I guess you could say, to a movie club that we did it was over a year ago. It was when we were first kind of starting the movie club thing. It was probably the fourth or fifth one we did. The movie club thing, if you're unaware, being where we as a group chat get together and talk about one particular movie every couple of weeks. And for one of those early ones, I chose The Talented Mr. Ripley. So we talked about that, and we kind of talked about Purple Noon a little bit in that video also, and now that makes me want to go further into the Ripley series, and we're going to talk about Ripley Under Ground. And it's very, not very well-known movie adaptation. Maybe for good reason, I don't know, but obviously Ripley's Game with John Malkovich also had a questionable release at first, but at some point it was kind of found, and I just don't think Ripley Underground's movie ever was, it seems. What's interesting about it, just right away from the start, is we'll talk about the movie and the book also together, but to talk about how the movie opens, it opens with a Patricia Highsmith quote, which makes sense. The one that's, I think it's criminal the way people get so worked up about a little murder, which is the perfect quote to start this with because it sounds like something that would come directly from Ripley's mouth, that she would write for him rather than say in her actual life. But it's funny that it starts with a Patricia Highsmith quote, given how far off the book this goes. And this is probably going to come up, but the thing about it is, I'm not one of those people that needs an adaptation from a book to be exactly by the word. Like, I'm not going to freak out if, they change something, or maybe they use the book as just a jumping off point and decide to kind of go their own way and tell their own story that was sort of inspired by it. But when first of all, when the source material is good enough to where it doesn't really feel like there's a reason to deviate, especially deviate as much as this movie does, it's also, if you're going to go in the direction of just making the most generic movie you can possibly make, with a story here that feels kind of unique in its own, but with obviously thriller elements that are recognizable, but surely, as we know, Highsmith's one of those authors that might seem like if you're reading it these days, oh, I kind of feel like I've seen these beats before, and all this feels like kind of a routine thriller. Yeah, Highsmith was kind of setting those foundations. So it's like anything that feels like it's a retread, if you're reading her, probably came from her, or at least she was in the early development stages of these becoming cliches or tropes or whatever for the thriller genre. But this movie from 2005, I believe, feels very much like it's not really breaking much ground or coming from a place that was breaking ground, even if you look at it as, oh, but the source material came from a time where these were sort of we were starting to build what these tropes would be, or originating them, but it's a very unsatisfying movie, for a very satisfying book, but I do like the way they felt like they were trying to connect it to The Talented Mr. Ripley, the Anthony Minghella movie with Matt Damon, which, while not the first Ripley movie adaptation, certainly is probably the most well-known. But, yeah, so when it opens, it feels like, these opening credits feel like they're in the same universe as the Matt Damon movie, which is great. And so it can kind of feel like a spiritual sequel to it. I don't know rights-wise how much they could connect it, but I mean, if they're adapting the book, there's already those connections to The Talented Mr. Ripley in Ripley Underground's book, so I don't really know what's going on with that. I don't know how much they maybe had to cut out, but I don't know. It almost feels like there was some legal reason they had to cut some of the things out that they do. Like I said, at the same time, if they're adapting the book, I don't see how that's a thing, but that's a whole other conversation, I guess. So, talking about a big change right here immediately that I love that Highsmith does is the way she has faith enough in her readers to give us a little bit of something at the beginning that she knows we're not really going to understand. But the thing about it is she lets us kind of she introduces our brains into how they're going to function in her world, where we have to put the pieces together ourselves a little bit. So the first chapter of the book is the events already having happened with Derwat, where he's been killed potentially by suicide, and then how they took over and they made the company surrounding him, and they've basically been getting comfortably rich off of that. And they set this up in this way. She sets this up in this way where we're kind of putting the pieces together, but there's still some vague details about how they got to this point. He and Jeff and everybody. But then we kind of reverse as we go into the second chapter, and then we get the full explanation of what happened. But I like that first chapter that doesn't give us everything at first. Like I said, it kind of helps our brain set into place of, putting things together and figuring things out for ourselves without it being explicitly told to us. Obviously, the movie takes a largely different approach in showing us the whole backstory with Derwat, and not even showing it as like this sort of flashback kind of thing. The movie is in like chronological order, but the thing about it is everything that they cover, everything that she covers in this sort of early explanation of, so this is what happened, and then we tell the story. The movie is like an hour 30, it might be an hour 40, and then it spends the entire first half an hour or 35 minutes giving us the backstory. Like, we spend time with Derwat. They kind of change where Cynthia is in the story, where instead of her just being, Bernard's girlfriend and then his ex, she was, I guess, with Derwat, and then she had an on-off thing with him. And the way they integrate Cynthia into the movie feels really off. You can tell they took out some characters from the book, and they're kind of using her to replace those characters and replace the hole they would leave when you take them out. And her as a character in general just doesn't really work. I also don't know about Claire Forlani's casting. That also seems kind of misplaced also. But yeah, the thing here is it could be fine. Like I said, if it's good enough on its own merits, it doesn't have to be a direct, very specific adaptation and go right down to the letter of everything that's in the book. But the way they handle it, where we have this whole chase sequence with Derwat that ends with him crashing the car and dying, very, very abruptly, very uncinematically, and they gather around the body, and it's like, this is how a lot of great thrillers start, is a bunch of people standing around a dead friend and not knowing what to do. And the fact that there's crime going on here. This is trope or not, this is the start of so many great thrillers, and there's so much you can do with this and build suspense off of. The scene feels completely suspenseless. A lot of contrived stuff going on here, like Eloise sleeping through the whole thing. And you can tell that they're kind of... They really kind of back themselves into a corner with playing this much into the backstory and making it an entire fraction of the movie itself. And it's like, I feel like there's a reason Highsmith didn't feel the need to go that into detail about these things. Not only... For multiple reasons, I feel like she did it. Because not only is it just... It's not that necessary to know... We only need some very specific details about what happened here in order for the rest of the story... In the book is basically the whole story to be able to operate. But there's also the air of mystery, because that's another thing that she does. This sort of mystery thriller kind of thing. And all of that is missing when you have this very poorly thrown together 35 minutes to start this movie with, where we see everything play out in a very... Things that should be very, very dramatic, playing out in a very undramatic way. So that's unfortunate. And then that's not helped by that very low-budget explosion that happens. That superimposed explosion on the car when it hits the tree. That's not doing anybody any favors. And so, yeah, it's weird to watch this and see them doing what is essentially the reverse of what an adaptation usually is. Where usually, when you're adapting a book for a movie, there's so much you have to cut out and take out and kind of work out in that way. And this spends half an hour putting stuff in. And usually that'd be, like, if you were to just say that without seeing the movie, you'd think, oh, that's interesting to kind of do the reverse of what an adaptation usually is. This must feel innovative in a way. And it's like, oh, they must have had some creativity they really wanted to put in this, some additions to the story or whatever. There's one detail they put in the movie that hardly comes into play, and it's much more, not near as much as it should. The idea of having Tom basically having taken up acting kind of feels like it's this perfect precursor to these scenes where he's going to play Derwent, as we see in the book, or so we think is going to happen in this movie. And so the idea of seeing him like take enjoyment out of being other people, where it's like becoming Dickie in The Talented Mr. Ripley made him want to take up acting to kind of feed that, is a very interesting idea and a very cool idea. But like I said, they don't really use it because you would think, if you going into the movie having already read the book, this is the setup. This is them setting up the fact that he's gonna put on a whole costume and the fake facial hair and all that and play Derwent for people. Particularly Murchison, who's going to come in a minute. But the way they play this up is he does it once, very briefly, very last minute. It feels not planned whatsoever. So it essentially makes Tom... The way this scene plays out, where he has to dress up as Derwent and pose as him for Murchison, feels like it's making Tom inept, which is like the exact opposite of Ripley in general. I mean, Ripley can be very reckless, for sure, and he'll do very impulsive things, make very impulsive decisions. But this in particular is something that it makes sense was... I mean, it's very last minute in the book where it's like, oh, I think I can do this. But he's got, like, the whole flight over there to work it out. It feels like it was literally, oh, Murchison's at my front door, what do I do? Oh, I'll slap on a fake beard. And when you put it that way, you make that kind of plan that last minute, it looks like the worst plan ever, especially since it doesn't work at all. So, like I said, that on top of it, like, it makes sense in the book where it is a ridiculous plan, but it gradually doesn't work. Where it's like, there's a whole scene where Murchison's talking to him, and he's like, oh, your hands are familiar. And then it builds on that, where it's like, oh, if those are familiar, then other things are starting to become familiar. Oh, that's you. And then it's a whole build-up to him killing Murchison. So there's a couple of things that feel off about this when you look at how the book did them versus how the movie does them. I said the whole thing about it just makes Tom look foolish. That the beard thing and the costume thing barely worked at all for like 30 seconds before Murchison figured it out. But there's also the fact that I love that when you read and watch The Talented Mr. Ripley, how shocking and sudden Dickie's death is. Because at that point in the story and movie, we don't know what Tom's capable of. So this is the first time we've seen that he's, like, resorted to murder, like I said, through that sort of impulsive sort of recklessness that he has, despite how calculated he can be and he's capable of being. But what works about the way he kills Murchison in the book is that Dickie's death has already set us up for the possibility that a character that looks like they could be a main character could be killed by Ripley in this sudden impulsive moment halfway through, so like Dickie was. So, and that was the surprise factor, was that Dickie was killed in the story so early and so suddenly. So Ripley Under Ground's book throws us a curveball by killing off Murchison even earlier than Dickie was. You suspect that's probably going to happen because we have the precedent of Dickie, but you don't realize how soon he's going to kill Murchison in the story, which is this great curveball. The movie barely utilizes Willem Dafoe at all, and there's no real build-up to anything. Like it's one thing where, like I said, it's great how abrupt and early Murchison is killed in the story, but there was build-up to it, and not to mention when I talked about the fact that they added an entire half an hour to the story with the backstory they could have covered in 2 minutes. and left room in the runtime for suspense and build up and, you know, quiet dread and stuff like that, and stuff that we know is coming, but dragging it out just enough that the anticipation of it is driving us crazy. You could have done all that, but you have that entire first half hour that kills most of our runtime. So by the time Murchison is actually killed, the movie's halfway done. That whole surprise factor of how early Murchison is killed off in the book is gone now. Because we're like halfway into the movie. We're maybe over halfway into the movie when we get to this point. Which means it's this moment. It sinks in your chest because you're like, well, shit. That means a lot of the great stuff that happened after Murchison's death is going to be completely cut out of this script, isn't it? So this is where I feel like the movie really hits something. But before we even get to the worst part of adapting it from the book to this script is the idea of something that Highsmith has done really well. And one of the sort of great, you know, I guess you could say tropes of the thriller genre is the disposal of a body moment that's in a lot of great thrillers. And it's a moment where, like, if you're a fan of thrillers, it's a sequence that never gets old. And you think, like it kind of feels like Hitchcock sort of popularized it in movies when you think, like, that whole 10-minute sequence with no dialogue in Psycho where it's just Norman Bates disposing of Marion Crane's body, and how enticing that is, and how weirdly drawn in you are by watching that. Just the meticulous detail that goes into this disposal and the sort of getting away with a crime. And it's like, and Hitchcock feels like the perfect comparison because obviously he very famously adapted Strangers on a Train, which is a Patricia Highsmith book. So the ideas go hand in hand here, and that's the thing. There's this morbid excitement that people like Highsmith or Hitchcock found in audiences watching people get away with a crime, many times involving the disposal of a body. So obviously, once he's killed Murchison, we're at that glorious point in thriller land where it's like, oh, now we get a long sequence of body disposal. Like I said, we thriller fans are fucked up in that way, I guess. Like I said, the morbid excitement is the best way I can describe it. I feel like that doesn't make me feel insane, and hopefully the rest of us don't feel insane. But, yeah, we just skip over that entirely. There's not a whole lot of body disposing in this movie. So, instead, we get moments that should be suspenseful, but for some reason, the movie decided to go for slapstick in its place. There's a whole sequence devoted to him chasing the dogs around the house, or having the dogs chase him around the house, so that he can bathe them because they get Murchison's blood all over them. And it's played as like this comedy routine more than anything else. There's the moment where he's being questioned by Tom Wilkinson, and the dog comes up with Murchison's hairpiece, and it's like, well, this would be suspenseful, but I don't even know what genre you think you're in. So there seems to be no real danger here as far as Ripley getting caught. So it's a really weird route to take, and I get black comedy. I understand what they were going for, sure. And there's, just as we talked about Hitchcock, there's plenty of black comedies that involve disposing of a body. So that's another, like, staple of black comedy, much as it is serious thrillers. So I can see where that is, but it just does not work in this scenario because even in black comedies, the suspense factor is still there. And here, like I said, it seems like every possible place you could have suspense in the movie was almost trying to actively avoid it. So, I don't know, it just doesn't work. Trying to combine the slapstick into Highsmith's style of thriller, I don't know. I mean, she's definitely got, you know, dark humor in there. There's dark humor in Ripley Under Ground, the book, but that comes later also, and that's the next point that I kind of wanted to get to. But I just wanted to really specify how much we as thriller lovers love the idea of the body disposal scene, and the movie basically just cutting that out is so weird. It's such a bad choice. It's a really, really bad choice. and one that I can't fathom anybody making. So let's talk about, though, what I feel like is the most egregious thing that they cut out of the movie. They cut a lot out of the movie, but they also completely changed a particular dynamic. So, I don't know about anybody else, but when I was reading Ripley Underground, I felt like, at the end of the day, despite everything else that's going on in the merchants and stuff like that, and what they're doing with the DeWalt Company and stuff like that, Ripley Underground is a story about Tom and Bernard at the end of the day. And that's the way I see it, just kind of in total. Is when you look at that story and you look back on it and all the events of it, and the entire second half of it, at least, it's a story about Tom and Bernard and their relationship. And there's so many interesting things about this. Bernard is such an interesting, unpredictable character, and as far as like finding the suspense factor, to take this guy that seems like this sort of nervous wreck and is kind of trying to do the right thing, but he's been put in this situation where he's, committing crimes and all that, seemingly against his will. And then as the story goes on, this guy becomes more unhinged and unpredictable and potentially scary compared to Tom Ripley. This is a guy that Tom Ripley becomes afraid of as this story goes on. And that's such an amazing dynamic, because when we start with him, one of the first ways he describes Bernard in the book is how, like, painfully honest he is. And that's the thing, is because Ripley is a character that's all about deceit, and the fact that he will recklessly kill somebody if it means keeping his deceit going. A guy like Bernard having a relationship with Tom Ripley might as well be a death sentence. So take that dynamic into it, and then see how they're exact opposites of each other, where they're coming from. But then these moments fall into place, where after Murchison is killed and he brings Bernard in to help him with the disposal because they're both in this, and we see Bernard's mind really start to come unhinged as it goes. And there are these moments where, like I was saying, it seems like they're total opposites, and a guy like Bernard would never survive a friendship with somebody like Ripley because of how different they are and his honesty. But as they're as they're moving Murchison's body, there's these moments, multiple moments, where Ripley is talking about when he's with Bernard in this moment, he's speaking out loud the way he usually does in his head. Like, in a way that he's never spoken to an actual person before. And it's like this part of Ripley that only he has known, this part of his mind that nobody else has seen, that he keeps hidden away, comes out so casually with Bernard. And there's also the moment where he talks about how he laughs with Bernard when they're disposing of this body, like he does when he's alone. Like when he's doing morbid things, that the way those things amuse him, he's able to laugh that way with Bernard with him and right in front of him. And it's like there's a connection with Bernard that we've never seen Ripley have with another character. Yeah, we saw him kind of become obsessed with Dickie in a way, but it wasn't like Dickie always had a distance, because Dickie had a distance with everybody, but the connection that he feels with Bernard is something that's so out of character in this really bizarre and interesting and intriguing way that really draws us into the second half of this story. And it's like, and like I said, how Bernard becomes more unpredictable as it goes on, and the fact that while they're out walking, Ripley basically says he's afraid of him because he doesn't know, because he does that thing where he hangs the dummy with wearing his suit, which is such a fucking insane thing to do. And it's like, it feels like that's a real turning point, where it's like, oh, I think Ripley found somebody crazier than he is, actually. And naturally, he feels extremely connected to this person. Somebody that started off as the total opposite of him has now basically surpassed him in this great way. And it's also interesting how he feels such this connection with Bernard and has such this weird, fucked up relationship with him, I love, this is where the dark humor comes in that Highsmith has. I love how casual Bernard's attempt on Tom's life is. He he hits him over the head, thinks he kills him, and tries to bury him, which is where the title comes from. And of course, this is a scene that's not even in the movie, so take that for what you will. But yeah, he sees, it's almost like he sees being buried alive as a minor inconvenience, finds his way out, and the first thing he does when he gets home is make a sandwich. And it's like it was, he's just nearly been killed by the person he feels connected to, and it's just like, it's like he saw it coming. He's like, yeah, that's about where I thought this would end up right now. Time for a sandwich. And it's and it's this amazing relationship, and it's like I said, it's so unpredictable. You have no idea where it's going, but to see this connection that he feels, that feels one way, that's the crazy thing too. Like it was one way with Dickie, but it's a completely different monster here with Bernard, and Bernard's such this interesting, wild character, and it doesn't. And Bernard would rather be anywhere else than in this story. And so, not to mention the whole sequence where Tom follows him around town and he thinks he's seeing a ghost is wild, and just everything I just said is not in the fucking movie. And the thing about it is, when I saw the cast list, it was like Ian Hart as Bernard. Okay, that seems that this could really work. This could be really interesting. That could be a really interesting dynamic. Okay, but I think what happened was, and I don't want to say that, I don't want to seem like I wasn't giving the movie a chance, but to be totally honest with you, Ian Hart has a pretty specific look. Like he's kind of got the balding thing going on, and he's got a very recognizable face. I feel like you could say he's Jason Isaacs-esque. And I could see him playing this nervous character that has the really dark side and a twisted side that's coming out basically involuntarily. He could have totally made this work, and I gotta be honest with you, as soon as the movie comes on and I saw him in that stupid wig, I felt like I already knew they fucked this up. You know? It's like, oh, well, I don't know if he's trying to do like a hippie thing or a rock star thing or what they were going for when they put that wig on. That Ron Weasley wig on him. And there had to have been jokes on the set about putting Professor Quirrell in a Ron Weasley wig, is what happened. And yeah, that dynamic is like totally gone. It feels like Bernard's barely in this movie. And we do have the sequences where he's like working with Wilkinson and trying to basically uncover Ripley, with none of this stuff in between. And that's the thing too, is the idea of making Bernard so outward with everything. Like he goes to Wilkinson, he's like, oh, Ripley's this, oh, Derwat's body's here, and all that. And it's like, the intriguing thing about the relationship between Tom and Bernard in the book is that it feels so secretive. It feels like so just between them. Like, one of them could be the other's imaginary friend. Like, that's how, like, intimate and secretive this whole relationship feels. And, like I said, that to me is the book. That's what the book is that relationship. And they cut so much Bernard out of the movie. And just made him they made Bernard an annoying character. Like, I started to get annoyed whenever he was on screen, and I don't think that's just because he was so different from book Bernard. I think they just ruined the character, and that's because that could have been some of the strongest, easily the strongest stuff in this movie. They had a gold mine. This is what I was talking about, where it's like, I don't need an exact word-for-word adaptation, but to take the strongest part of the book, which is like half the fucking thing, and cut it all out for a more generic thing that where you can't even decide on a genre, where you want it to be this slapstick black comedy or a genuine thriller, and it doesn't even feel like you're trying to mesh the two. It's like, oh, sometimes we're a slapstick comedy and sometimes we're a thriller, and it's like, well, okay, at least try to bring them together. But it feels like so many different things are going on, tone-wise, and I don't... Yeah. How amazing would the scene have been to see him attempt to... We get the scene where he attempts to kill Ripley, but he doesn't even try to bury him. Despite the goddamn title... I know you could take the title, the title has multiple meanings, but I mean, the literal one is there, in the story. And you don't even use that. He leaves him there, on top of the ground, and I guess expects his body to stay there. It's very, very frustrating. So, because you had a goldmine of a movie here, in this book, and... the point I was trying to make was, wouldn't you have loved to have seen the scene where he rises out of the ground and goes and makes a sandwich? Like, how amazing would that have been? I didn't even mention yet that Barry Pepper is playing Ripley now. Because his Ripley doesn't leave much of an impression, but because of this movie's whole production and how much they fucked it up, I'm not going to put that on Barry Pepper, because obviously Barry Pepper's a really talented and diverse and amazing actor. And there is a universe, there is a movie where he's a great Ripley. But this one is not really it. This movie, the way they play this movie up especially, you can almost say that he might feel miscast, but I feel like, I do feel like there is a Ripley movie out there where Barry Pepper could play him. I also think it's interesting that by this point Barry Pepper had already worked with I think 3 of the previous existing Ripleys, because he did Saving Private Ryan with Matt Damon, and then he did Knockaround Guys, where he has multiple scenes with Dennis Hopper and Malkovich. And it's like, I wonder, having already established working relations with them, if he went to them at all before he played his version of Ripley. But yeah, so that's frustrating too, because it's like, I know he's got a Ripley in him, but the way this movie deals with the characters and adapts them, it just doesn't feel like any of it's working. There's scenes where it's like, there's moments where it feels like it might almost be there, but the movie always finds ways to undermine itself, and like I said, goes down, tries to make itself the most generic movie it possibly can. When you look at directors like Anthony Minghella and stuff like that, or Wim Wenders or whatever, it's like you can see people bringing their own styles and artistic qualities to the Ripley story, but there's something like, there's a spirit there that comes through, and like I said, besides the opening credits kind of reminding you of Minghella's movie, you don't really get the vibe that anything feels like a connection here. Roger Spottiswoode is the director, who has a very diverse filmography. He's done everything from Turner and Hooch to Tomorrow Never Dies, and I think it's mostly been shit as of late, like random straight to streaming stuff or straight to DVD stuff. But he's had a very interesting career, and I can't think of a movie in his filmography that would have made me say Ripley movie. But I don't know. It's all over the place. And talking about connections also, completely deleting Chris Greenleaf from the story is not surprising, because like I said, it would have been like a direct sequel to Minghella's movie, which, like I said, I don't know legally what was going on there, if they could or what. But I love the inclusion of Chris, because not only does he add suspense, because he's always around at the worst time. Same thing for the Count, that's kind of lingering around in those early scenes, when Murchison was still in the picture. But not only is Chris causing problems by just being a constant witness, but just that idea of the Greenleaf family and, like, Dickie constantly still lingering and constantly coming back also feels like it's like things closing in around Ripley. As we're breaking off into new stories and new crimes that already have their own life, and the Greenleafs just keep resurfacing, and like the spirit of Dickie keeps resurfacing, and so that's something that I love in the book also with that character. But like I said, I don't even think the name Greenleaf is said in the movie, so fuck that shit, I guess. So, and I guess talking about the direction, Spottiswoode has made some good movies, but as far as the direction of this movie goes, I can't deal with those fucking dissolved transitions that are constantly going on throughout this, and the softcore scenes with Eloise. Eloise is another character where it's like, it was much better. Here we get the whole, they meet for the first time, and they have their whole, banter of, oh, they're building this sort of chemistry, and then they have a bunch of softcore sex scenes, and it's like, just already having her established as his wife when the book starts is so much smoother, so much cleaner. And it's another one where you just have a constant witness there, and it's always kind of unclear what exactly she's in on and what she's not always in on. The movie decides to play with that at the very last minute, like in the very last scene, and it's too little too late with that. The payoff feels very unearned. Most of the payoffs feel very unearned. And like I said, it's like they were going out of their way to just make it as boring and generic as possible. And so I try to think about it as, how would I have... Just to my understanding, this movie was actually surprisingly well received by the 2 people that saw it. The 2 people in the world that have seen it. But I don't... I don't know how I would have... I felt like, as somebody who loves, this type of thriller usually, if I hadn't read the book and just saw the movie, I probably would have thought it was fine. But I probably would have hated the Bernard character, which is not how I'd want to come away from an adaptation of Ripley Under Ground, because it's the exact opposite of how I feel about the book. But so yeah, at most I feel like if I completely cut the book out of my mind, if I could go back and not have read the book and I just saw the movie blind, I'd say at best I would think it was okay. And maybe the little payoffs at the end would be a bit more, to feel a bit more clever and surprising, but they're just very lackluster in comparison to what Highsmith is capable of, and changing her words as much as possible is just not the way to go, not with this story. So that's, I think, how I feel about this. Like I said, I don't want to feel like I'm going after the movie just because it's not a good adaptation. If you were to look at it just on its own legs, it's still a very generic and sometimes boring attempt at a thriller. Listen, that's the thing too, is in points where, like, I know where the story's going because because I couldn't put the book down. Somehow the movie manages to be boring in places. That's an accomplishment in itself, I guess. I don't know. An accomplishment and adaptation in itself, I guess. So, that's how I feel about that. But, yeah, the book is great, though. And, of course, as you can see, this is the book that's the collection of the first 3 Ripleys. So, as you probably guessed, and as we kind of mentioned here, there are 2 movie adaptations of Ripley's game. And if you want to talk about those, maybe you'll come back in a few days. And we'll continue this we'll start off as a movie club for Down to Mr. Ripley, then just this review here for Ripley Underground, and we've got 2 different versions of Ripley's game, so if you're familiar with the segments we do on this channel, you probably know what the next thing we're going to do is in the next couple of days, or few days. So maybe we'll see you for that. So until then, I think that's it.